Hello, this is Mrs. Politsky, and I have AP Psychology, Chapter 7 notes, talking a little bit about cognition, and we're going to focus today on language. So, how do children acquire language? Well, newborns, for the most part, they know no words at all, and yet it doesn't take any time at all, and they become very fluent in the language. Um, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a spoken language or we could be talking about, for example, American Sign. If you're using it, chances are you will probably learn it. So, infants and children face an especially important developmental task with the acquisition of language. Language structures in the brain. According to the innateness theory of language, children acquire language not merely by imitating, but it's also by following an inborn program of steps to acquire vocabulary and grammar of the language in their environments. Noam Chomsky spent a lot of time studying this, and he proposed that children are born with mental structures built into their brain that make it possible to comprehend and produce speech. The Broca's area, that is the motor speech controller in the cerebral cortex, is involved in that. Chomsky came up with something that is known as LAD, or the language acquisition devices, and basically this is the biologically organized mental structures in the brain that facilitate the learning of language because it is innately programmed with some of the fundamental rules of grammar. And it basically comes down to the idea that regardless of where babies are around the world, they all learn language roughly the same way. The LAD is roughly like a computer chip. It constrains some of the basic rules common to all human languages. One such rule might be the distinction between maybe nouns and verbs. Children worldwide seem to proceed through very similar stages of learning in their native languages, and a logical hypothesis for explaining this pattern would be that children possess an inborn program for language development that automatically runs at certain times in a child's life. Babies pay attention to the sounds and also the rhythms of the sound strings when they hear other people speak, especially the beginnings and endings and stressed syllables. Relying on their built-in listening guides, young children deduce the patterns and the rules for producing their own speech. Babbling is the foundation for language, and infants have the natural ability to produce nearly all sounds heard in all languages. Acquiring vocabulary and grammar. For the most part, learning the basic grammar and vocabulary in a native language represents basically an important project for children in their first few years of life. When a child is roughly 2 years old, they have knowledge of roughly 1,000 words. By the time they are ready for kindergarten or in kindergarten, that jumps up to 10,000 words. And that kind of equates to roughly 9 new words a day, roughly 1 new word for every waking hour. There are 3 stages of vocabulary and grammar development. There is a one-word stage, which usually happens somewhere around when an individual is 12 months old or roughly a year old. Basically, it could be like mom, dad, roughly single nouns for the most part. That progresses to 2 words, so it could be my dog or bad dog. Telegraphic speech is something known as kind of lacking some of the grammatical rules, so like daddy here rather than daddy is here. It sounds kind of awkward, but for the child it kind of makes sense. Children pass through something known as a name or a naming explosion, and this happens around the time a child is about a year and a half, 18 months old. Children's words, for the most part, are accelerating rapidly. At this stage, children may delight at pointing at objects and trying to name them, even if they're not quite right. After about 6 months, the naming explosion subsides, and children begin to use one-word utterances in different sequences to convey more complex meanings. The two-word stage happens somewhere around 2 years of age. The range of meanings children convey increases tremendously. Children first developed the language rules known as grammar at this stage. Grammar, for the most part, these are the rules of language. They specify basically how to use words, morphemes, your syntax, all of that. Telegraphic speech, this is 2 to maybe 3 word sentences or short, simple sequences of nouns and verbs without plurals, or function words like the or and or of. So ball hit, bend, cry, things like that. Children learn modifiers. These are adjectives and adverbs, and articles, the and those. They must learn how to put words together grammatically. Your morphemes, these are meaningful units of language that make up words. Some whole words are morphemes, like the word word. Other morphemes include grammatical components that alter a word's meaning. Overregulation, this is applying a grammatical rule too widely and thereby creating an incorrect form. So that might include adding an extra D or an ED. So an example of this, I hitted the ball, Sally breaked her toe. All right, we have finished.